Good morning.
You're recording.
I'd like to call the budget meeting for October 3rd to order. Noting all board members on the committee are here. Need to approve the agenda, please.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Next, public comments. I don't remember seeing any. Do you have any public comments? So we'll move on. At this point, I'll turn it over to Steve to discuss the timeline and directions.
Thank you, Jack. So our goal is to try to be done within an hour, so everyone can get on with their day. We'll do a cabinet meeting, so Randy mentioned he's gonna leave partway through the meeting, don't get that going. But then Alan and I will stay throughout the meeting. We're gonna primarily talk about 23-24 budget planning. So the month of October is when Allie and I have the opportunity to really finalize all of the work that we've been doing for the past year. We don't need to bring up the timeline, but just sharing with you that during this month, we have the annual meeting on Monday, October 16th. Following the annual meeting, the next Monday, which is October 23rd, we have a special meeting to set the budget of the tax levy. And that's the meeting at which we will have all of the final numbers from the state. And we'll be able to present information to the board and the community that evening on the completion of the process. We do have an agenda item that we're going to come to in a moment, where administration needs feedback from this committee regarding a particular property tax levy topic. And so we will get to that in just a moment. But are there any questions about what we're doing over the next couple of weeks?
Nope.
So the next topic, you did receive an email from Allie already on the student count. So the state requires us to take an official count the third Friday in September. We will also be including this information in the board packet for the regular October meeting. Student count basically falls into three main categories. There's Waunakee resident students who are attending our district. There are open enrollment in students, so those are students who reside in a different community who've opted for open enrollment in, and then there's open enrollment out. Open enrollment out is Waunakee students who have selected an option to attend a public school outside of our community. So we have columns on that chart for each of those three different groups of students. We then end up counting them for revenue limit purposes. We end up counting our resident students plus our resident students out. But we often refer to the student count as the students who are actually attending school here, which is really the resident students and the open enrollment in students. So when you see something like the third draft included an estimate of 4423, that would have been resident students plus open enrollment in. So the count ended up being, the third draft included an estimate of 4423, which was compared to 4406. Randy did share prior to the start of the school year that we were within one of that number of what we were estimating. And since then, we've had some student withdrawals, and basically what happens is we don't always have families let us know that they've made other decisions. So we're assuming the students coming back, they're in our count. We get to the third Friday count in September and have verified that they're not actually in attendance here, and then therefore we don't count them. So until we really get to that point, it's difficult for us to really be able to get the actual number. For perspective, when you look at all three of those different types of students, we're within about $25,000 of our budget planning process. So it's very close. The open enrollment in, there's a few more in students than we were predicting, which each student in brings about $8,000 more. There were a few more out students than we were predicting. Out students actually are Waunakee residents, so we count them for the state revenue limit formula. So in a nutshell, between all of it, it's very, very close to what it was that we were estimating.
So Steve, students in are about 8,000 per student, students out are about 8,000.
Yep,
That's
it's
one.
the same number, yeah. And so, any questions on the student count? Otherwise, you can get a chance to look at it. We'll have it on our agenda next Monday.
So is that number the actual number then we have? Or is that we still have to subtract 16 to get the actual number that we have attended?
So the 4406 is the actual number.
Okay.
Rebecca, you want to just bring it up for a minute? I can go to the last. If you want to go to the next page. Down at the very bottom, there's residents, that's the 4161, open enrollment in is the 245, and the out is 60. And so those are the grand totals for all the grades.
And that's over and above last year. There's more students.
The open enrollment out is up, the open enrollment in is up. The resident number is down from what we were estimating.
It was 44 was the September.
Yep. The next topic is the one that we were hoping to spend the most amount of time on today. This topic is property tax levy options. Rebecca, if you wouldn't mind bringing that presentation up. Then you want to go to the first slide. So just as a reminder, when we had the school board retreat in July, we revisited what the board's goal has been regarding the topic of property taxes in the community. And the goal at a high level has been consistency. So our goal has been to be as consistent as we can with a property tax bill in the Waunakee community. We've referenced the reason for that goal is so that families and businesses can plan for one of their larger expenses that they have each year. We kept a consistent property tax rate in 18-19 through 21-22. We were intending to keep a consistent rate for last fall, so for 22-23. But we learned pretty late in the process, if you remember, that there was a very large increase in equalized values in our community. And if we did not decrease the tax rates, it would have resulted in some pretty large increases in property taxes for folks. So as a budget committee, you ultimately recommended an approach to keep the total tax bill consistent by dropping the tax rate to $9.68. And we shared with you just an example home that was built in 2017 at the retreat, how 5 years later, it's within $100 of where it was, previously. So that's an example of consistency and really, our best attempt to try to reach that. You wouldn't mind moving to the next slide? So where have we been planning so far this year? So our planning to this point has been to keep that same approach. So in the third draft of the budget that the board approved in July, there was a 3% increase in the property tax levy across all funds. The intent of that was to get as close to possible to this term called net new construction, which really is the new property that comes onto the tax rolls on an annual basis. If our tax levy increase is similar to the increase in new construction, that means consistency in the taxes for all the other taxpayers in the district. And so in order to, again, try to do the best we can for that goal of consistency, we were looking at a 3% increase in the tax levy this fall. Rebecca, do you want to move on? To help us really dial in on that net new construction, we ask our financial advisor to provide estimates for us that we can use for this data. The reason why we have to ask for some assistance with this is the state does not provide public schools with this data. This data goes to municipalities. So the village of Waunakee gets data on their new construction. The town of Westport does as well, but it's not provided to districts with how much of Westport is Waunakee schools versus Middleton schools. So we have to do our best to try to estimate. To make sure that we could dial this in as close as we could, Allie and I reached out to Westport and the city of Middleton to try to get additional breakdowns of how their new construction is lining up between Middleton schools and Waunakee schools. So then we factor that in to get as close as we could, which we're estimating at about 3.2%. So we were intending again to have our property tax levy then be adjusted to be right around that 3.2%, which is the best we can possibly do to keep that consistent approach from one year to the next. All right, Rebecca. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Allie and have Allie talk a little bit about some of the discussion that's been going on at some of the professional school business manager meetings that Allie's been attending and some of the work she's been doing on this. So Allie?
Sure. So a couple of weeks ago, I was at one of my MASBO meetings, and that's the region school business officials. They have meetings every couple of weeks, but someone brought up that in the state budget for 23 through 25, there was additional funding being put into school property tax levy credits. There wasn't a lot of discussion about this funding, but there is a pretty significant amount of money going into this particular area of the state budget. So we're fortunate enough that this could be a benefit to our district, but otherwise there was about $940 million being put into it for this school year. So of that $940 million, we would be able to utilize $1.9 million. This district, it would be spread across all of the taxpayers. So $1.9 million would be hitting tax bills for Waunakee School District, and those would be in the form of levy credits. So we also estimated that on each property tax bill, or for a home of $360,000, the average levy credit would be $172.
And just to add to that, so in Wisconsin, schools have been funded a couple of different ways over the last, call it 10 to 15 years. There have been some state budgets where the focus has been on the school levy credit. If you go back to when I first started my career, this wasn't really a topic that was funded by the state. The money for schools were put into equalization aid. The challenge with equalization aid is it affects every community differently. I mean, the formula was intended to do that. But when a school district is allowed to raise their revenue limits by $325 a student, there are districts that don't receive equalization aid. So for those districts, the $325 becomes a pure tax increase for the community. So one way that the state has mitigated this over time is to invest in a school property tax levy credit, which is distributed differently. So that money's not distributed like the aid formula. It doesn't take into account things like property value per student. It's not like a calculation like equalization aid, it's different. So the state chose in the 23-25 budget to do both forms of funding, the school levy credit and equalization aid. And so it's been a couple of years really since the state has invested additional dollars in this levy credit. So it really hasn't been on a lot of folks' radar because it just hasn't changed much. recently, but in the past, there were years where the school investments went this route. There were years that went equalization aid. And now we're learning, or we've been learning that in the 23-25 state budget, it's a blend between the two. If you want to move on to the next slide, Rebecca. And it's always important just to know where this is actually impacting a bill. So we took a bill for an example bill that's on the state website. And we circled where the school levy credit is being shown to taxpayers on their bill. And so it's just important to know with that increased investment from the state into the school property tax levy credit, that dollar amount on people's bills are going to go higher. So you're going to see in that circled area for everybody who's paying taxes in the community, you look at last year's and you look at this year's and you'll see it's going up. So the other thing to keep in mind, and this just makes the topic of property taxes more complicated, is the Village of Waunakee reassessment. And a reassessment always has to be looked at as a shift of school taxes between properties. But it's very, very difficult for people to understand this. And what I mean by that is we've heard that there are people, even though the village's average was, I think, somewhere around 25%, we've heard there's homes that have had a 50 and 60% change in their assessments. Their property tax bills are going to go up significantly no matter what any taxing entity does, because they're receiving a larger share of the tax that's being distributed in the village. If your home had an assessment increase below the average, then you're going to see a decrease as those taxes are being shifted between homes. And the reason for that is schools can't spend more. Schools don't tax more when a reassessment is occurring. It's the way the taxes are being distributed that has changed, because all of a sudden someone's house has become worth 50% more. So more tax goes that way. If someone else's house only changed 10%, less goes that way. And so that's just a factor to keep in mind. It was a pretty significant reassessment in the Village of Waunakee. There will be a lot of confusion from people around this. And there's going to be people who, if they were in that 40, 50, 60% range, are probably going to be reaching out to board members and saying, I don't understand what happened to my taxes, both village board members, school board members. The reality of that is it's a shift that's occurring between properties. Some are paying more, some are paying less, but it's just important to keep in mind that's happening in our community this year. And it's of a pretty big scale in the Village of Waunakee.
Is there something we can prepare ahead of time to have this guy ready saying these things and maybe giving this isn't a visual example we want to give, but just to kind of spell it out in its most simple form?
I think it's a good idea, because whatever we end up doing with our levy at the end of the month, I think communicating it is beneficial to at least help people understand what's happening. Because hopefully folks, when they did get their reassessment information, did read the information that the village communicated, because it did reference what the average was. And for folks who had a change quite a bit above the average, that should have been an indication that things were going to be different this year. But the more we can communicate that between all of the taxing entities, the better, for sure.
It'd be kind of interesting is if you could put some type of picture like a seesaw, where you get the small weight over here, big weight over here, and then the switch. And,
oh, sure.
Just
right,
something creative
visual.
on a visual standpoint.
Right, because of the balance.
We can,
right.
We can explain it, but some people might not be able to
Sure.
be able to see that.
Rebecca, if you wouldn't mind going to the next one. So where we are moving forward towards the end of October is there's a couple of different approaches that ultimately the budget committee could consider for recommendation to the full board. And we've lined out the, the three different core paths here. The first one, it's important to note that first bullet point is the path we were on. So the first bullet point is align the property tax levy increase with the increase in net new construction only. And then the result of that option is due to the 1.9 million in additional school levy credits. The net school property tax rate will decline and would not remain consistent. It would actually go down. The middle option, align the property tax levy increase with the increase in net new construction and levy for the additional 1.9 million in school levy credits. That's the option that keeps the net school property tax as consistent as possible. And then there's somewhere in between, which would be align the property tax levy increase with the increase in net new construction and some amount lower than the 1.9 million in the school levy credit. So we just threw an example in there, and that would result in the net property tax levy slightly declining. So the point of this slide is to share with you that just like last year, where we were on a certain path and we were going to keep the tax rate the same, we made an adjustment at the end of the process to lower the tax rate to make sure that we kept that goal of consistent property tax levy. Now we've learned about the investment also in the school levy credit and have been able to calculate that we would have to change direction just like we did last year if there is that same interest in keeping that consistency from one year to the next. If there is, we would go that middle route. If there's more of an interest in continuing to do what we were planning for, that's the top route. Or if there's an interest in saying, let's go somewhere in between, that's the lowest one. And to help you decide, if you could go to the next slide, Rebecca, to keep some bigger picture, points in mind. The only reason why there's property tax levy options is because we have referendum approved debt service. So if you're a school district right now that has no debt at all, in the revenue limit formula, you don't adjust for factors like a property tax levy credit because you can't change your Fund 10 levy higher. You're limited, you don't have the ability to do that. When you have a Fund 39, you can make changes. And to keep, in reference, the third draft of the budget has a Fund 39 levy of about $11 million. The amount we would need to pay the principal and interest payments for 2024 is $13.7 million. A board has the legal authority to levy more than that if a board wants to pay down principal and interest costs, which is called a debt service defeasance. If the budget committee and ultimately the board went that middle path, which we shared with you on the previous slide, that would mean Allie and I would change the Fund 39 tax levy to around 13.06 million. And then, like I said, there's a small adjustment for Fund 10 based on the student count that we'd have to do. And then if you could go to the next slide, Rebecca. And probably one of the longest and most important components in thinking this through is really our long-term financial planning. When we look ahead to a year from now, we're going to again have pressure on our tax levy because of the operational referendum fund, which continues, the $325 per student increase that's coming from the revenue limit formula, and increases in our debt service schedule. We are estimating we'd have to lower our Fund 39 levy by about $2 million next year to maintain that overall community tax consistency. And that the high point of our debt service schedule is 14.1 million in 2028. So we know long-term by 2028, we have to get the debt service levy up to 14.1 million. So the question in front of the committee right now for this fall is, do you want to continue with that concept of getting that tax levy as consistent as you possibly can? Which would mean we need to increase our Fund 39 levy later this month. Do you want to continue on the same course that we've been on, which Ally and I then estimated about a $360,000 home would have a drop in their taxes by about $172? Or do you want to do something in between? Keeping in mind this ultimate goal that we have to get to 14.1 million sometime in the next 5 years. So we're happy to review any of this with you. I know this is, this is stuff you've seen for the first time.
Yeah, so I get dropping those keeps the rate consistent, but if we don't drop them, I mean, if we do drop them, we're paying less on debt that we actually owe. And so if we decide that we know we want to maintain our debt pay requirements, what's the impact on the taxpayer?
So, Rebecca, would you mind going back to the previous slide? So are you looking at the 13.7 million that you're saying we have to pay in 2024?
Yeah,
So the reason why, and I should explain this a little more, so I appreciate you asking that. The reason why our levy's at 11 million, even though we have $13.7 million worth of debt to pay next year, is when we went to the community last fall and proposed the $175 million referendum, we had two different financial plans in front of the community. One of them was, if the referendum doesn't pass, the board was intending to prepay or pay down debt.
right.
If the other path was approved, which was approval of the referendum, we stated we're not going to prepay the debt. We're not going to do that. And those funds would remain in our debt service fund 39 so that we could manage our debt over time and have a consistent property tax levy for the community. So when we described this referendum, we described to folks our goal of a consistent property tax levy. So we're drawing down some of those reserves in 2024 that we didn't use to pay down debt so that we can keep that overall goal as we described to the community. But we would need to go up to the 13.7 million if we weren't going to draw down any reserves. Or we could go to that $13.1 million range, which would be the best we could do to be consistent with people's bills. If we went up to the 13.7, we would be increasing the property tax levy bills for the schools across the community. So our recommendation would be that if there was an interest to utilize the $1.9 million in funding coming through the levy credit route, that we would stay consistent with our message, only increase our tax levy by the net new construction, which does not increase taxes on residents that are currently here, and only use the levy credit, which would get us to the 13.0, not go up to the 13.7, because that would be inconsistent with what we've shared during the referendum process.
I think when we sit down and take a look at this, we have to get up to the 14 million. And I think if we can, step it up, it's probably the most efficient way to do it. Because otherwise, if we say, okay, we're gonna give the tax credit, to all of the community, it's $172, which is a lot of money. But at the end of the day, you balance that with, okay, we're gonna give today, but you're gonna pay tomorrow. Right? Because we're gonna have to increase taxes to get up to that $14 million bogey. So it would make sense to utilize that tax credit to incrementally get us to where we need to be.
If we were to increase 0.1 each year over year, then to get to the 14.1 by 2028, is there other things that would affect that, like this budget levy that we weren't prepared to, like, we didn't foresee that coming, that's locked in for.
Yeah, they're
These next-
investing even more next year, so it is in there for both years.
So, so if there's more next year, and I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind around it, we would still need to get to the 14.1 regardless of that, right? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the way you describe it, Jack, because it is really, it's both a short-term issue for this fall's bills. But primarily, it's a long-term issue really connected to the goal or the need to get to the 14.1 million. So if the credit were to go through this fall, that would certainly, change this fall's property tax levy on a short-term basis. But then ultimately, we have to levy up to the 14.1 million by 2028, so it'll come back. And so I think, not speaking for the board, but I think the goal over the last 5 years has been to avoid, kind of the ups and downs of people's personal property tax bills and to seek as consistent as possible. Again, it's very difficult for a school board to accomplish that goal over periods of time, which is why we're looking at this very carefully. It's why there's other Dane County area districts that Allie's speaking with are looking at this very carefully, because they're trying to do the same kind of approach in their community to have that consistency. So it's really just like last fall when we had a bit of a change in our process towards the end. This is another one that again is putting in front of the board, is that goal of consistency the most important goal over time, as opposed to, a potential change downward this fall.
So go ahead, Mark.
I thought I heard you say you're recommending that we go ahead with the slight drop this year. But then what's the plan for going up gradually so that we can be as consistent as possible?
So Rebecca, would you mind going back to the previous slide again? So what Mark's referencing is to pay all of the interest and principal for 2024, Allie and I will be paying $13.7 million worth of bills. If we go with the middle approach, which is to keep that goal of a consistent property tax levy, we'll be at about 13.0. The difference would be to draw down the reserves, and then over time, to your point, Mark, of how do you get up to the 14, it would be to balance the net new construction that we're seeing in the community each year to levy funds against that new construction that's occurring, to continue increasing that dollar amount ultimately up until the 14 million. And the good news in our long-term approach is, as board members, you have tools available to you to help you get there. Those tools include access to the interest earnings that we're currently making with the referendum funds. We've talked a little bit about that, but the interest funds can only be used for project work for referendum approved projects or for this. So interest money would be available to pay down debt and to pay for these costs. So we are in a good situation to be able to have that discussion.
When you look at interest, that's a one-time deal, right?
Yep.
So we can fill it for 1 year to get us here. This seems to be going on into the future. And I think the challenge you have is school funding. You know, it's been so up and down. The legislature and state government has been kind to us this year, but what happens, 2 years from now? So I think as we plan, going forward to get up here, it makes sense to use that tax credit to do this. And the other thing is we're gonna have to pay the debt, right? So if we get crunched on the school budget, from the state, because they don't give us the needed funds, the debt is always getting paid, and the pie is only so big. So what's going to happen, I would think, is Fund 10 is going to be reduced. So it's that balance that I think we have to look at going forward.
I think another way to kind of look at it is not every district has the flexibility to have the conversation we have. We're able to do this because we have debt to repay, we have that debt we're borrowing. And this is something that's going to allow us kind of, how do you now structure it? And we have conversations around this table all the time about how do we structure our debt? What's the best way to kind of organize how we are managing our funds and our repayment of debt? To me, this is just another one of those conversations as far as what leverage do we have within the system to be able to manage this for our taxpayers. And I think as we've gone back, that consistent tax rate has been well received. It's gotten rid of the spikes and valleys in the tax rate. So to me, this is something that we really should seriously consider as far as a way to manage this moving forward. I think as Steve clearly articulated, it's not only a short-term piece, but it helps us with that 2028 number as well.
As far as the timing, Randy has this as an agenda item next Monday, so it's not an action item next Monday. Because we won't be bringing back the final budget until 2 weeks after that, so that's that special board meeting. If this committee is prepared to give us a direction in preparing that budget, we would accept that today. If instead folks want to think about it and the board wants to talk about it next Monday, it is an agenda item. All we're looking for is some direction from the board in preparing the final budget documents at the end of the month.
If we made a motion to take the option to increase her debt, would that give you direction? And then, the board obviously has an opportunity to vote on it, but it gives you strong indication that, this committee endorses.
So just to follow kind of what Jack says, if the budget committee, puts their endorsement behind this here today, next Monday we'll have just an informational item at the board meeting. Steve's not going to be able to be at that meeting, but Ally can represent that very well to the board. We then have our annual meeting coming up week after that, and then we set the levy the week after that. So it's at the set the levy meeting where we have to make this decision. So that would at least give this committee the chance to kind of endorse it, an information item next week at the board meeting. If there's people who have questions after that, Steve and Ally can set up times to meet with board members to help clarify that before we set our final levy in that last week of October. Is that the flow you're looking at, Steve? No.
And will we accept the recommended action?
In favor?
Aye.
Thank you. All right, Rebecca, if you wouldn't mind going back to the agenda. So the next agenda item is just information that Amy was sharing with us administratively regarding the Act 20 training program. Basically, what we're sharing with you here is this is an example of what would be best described as a unfunded mandate that came out of the state budget. Rebecca, would you mind just opening that for a minute? So Amy put this together, and she was intending to come here, and then we realized there's a cabinet meeting as well, so I think she's probably at the cabinet meeting at this point. Where we put together, working with Amy, what were all of the costs associated with meeting the early literacy component of that new requirement in the state budget. And so Amy went ahead and put together her best estimate of what would be needed to meet that requirement. At the time she was putting this together, we were unclear as to whether or not we needed to try to seek additional funding from this committee and ultimately the board. However, Amy's been working with Ally and feels confident that between her carryover budget from last year and managing her funds for, between last year and this year, that she can fit this in. And just change direction a bit on what she was going to be doing with some of her funds. And so this is not a request for additional funding. It's more of just a heads up as far as an example of what can happen, through a state budget process, and really the training and the costs that we're going to need to go through to really meet these requirements moving forward.
Thank you.
This concern I have is if we're asking her to manipulate out of her curriculum account, some things that were considered priorities are not going to be attended to. And is there a way to find additional funding across the board to help cover it versus that curriculum account?
Yeah, we can definitely speak with her. I can't speak without her being here to what she's,
Right.
changing in her plans between her carryover and this, and maybe in the end, the carryover was higher than what she was thinking, and so therefore she's just directing it towards this. But yeah, absolutely, we can work with her to make sure it's not negatively impacting what other things that she was planning to do this year. At one point, we thought this was gonna be like a block grant to schools. And it's kind of turned out to be more of the funds are being kept at the DPI, and the DPI is providing some instructional materials, but then districts are needing to do this component of it. So it's definitely changed a bit, I think, from what early on schools thought this was gonna be.
Steve, is this a one-time program setup or?
That's a really good question. I believe there's some one-time initial training required. I'm guessing there's probably some training required for at least new people being brought in.
That's correct, that's correct. So this is, it has to be in place, with the start date of 2024, 2025, that I would recall, but after that point, it's recurring. So basically, it's kind of like we're gonna have a mass dose to all of our staff that we currently have. And then moving forward, as we bring new people in, they'll either have to pick this up in their training or previous school district, or we'll have to provide it.
So primarily, this is kind of a setup, getting everybody.
Yeah, this is like a, mass, get everybody, in theory, every K-3 teacher in the state gets
Right.
this by the deadline, and then after that, moving forward, we keep providing.
Understood.
All right, thank you. So starting to plan ahead a little bit, a couple of relatively quick topics. So historically, we've had our annual meeting occur as late as possible in October. One of the reasons why the board is like that is it's allowed us to share the most updated financial information, like the student count we're able to share, and other data at the meeting. The reality of it is the annual meeting is a very lightly attended meeting from a financial perspective. And the late date of the annual meeting is causing us very significant cash flow issues. We're not allowed to borrow until the annual meeting has taken place, which gives us a very tiny window between that third Monday in October and the payroll at the end of October to try to pull this off. And each year it gets tighter and tighter for us, to the point where Ally and I are looking at like every move we can make, like filing grant claims early and just doing everything we can to try to keep the cash flow working. It's become clear to us that we're nearing a point in time where we're gonna have to request to move the annual meeting to be somewhere between mid-August and early September. The point of that will be so that at the September board meeting, the cash flow borrowing could be approved and the funds could come in at least 3 weeks before we need it, which would be a lot better than, like the week we need it.
3 days.
Like 3 days.
Steve,
when we need it.
has this always been an issue since we moved it to in October, or what's changed to make it an issue?
It has been an issue in the recent past. And it's just become more of an issue over time. The larger our budget gets each year, the more of an imbalance we have. So every year as we keep moving forward and having inflationary increases in our budget, the gap between revenues and expenses just keeps getting bigger. And so our available balances just can't cover it. And so it has been an issue, but it's becoming a larger issue as we move forward.
So you need us to make a motion to.
So the
Change
annual
this, or-
meeting is in 2 Mondays. Our request would be that at the annual meeting, administration could review this topic with the community as a community resolution. Right now, the resolution gives the board the authority to set the date. That resolution would be fine. We would then just ask the board to move the date up. Or if the community decides to set the date, we would ask for the date to be set a little bit earlier.
Could we do it before the board meeting?
Sure.
So like the week before, the October board meeting, that gives you 3 weeks to, is that enough time?
So
Because I think we moved this, so that we have the best information from the state at the time.
Yeah, we would need to move it a week before the September board meeting. Which we can do, because we would definitely have, quite a bit of information at that point. Obviously, we'd have the student count, we'd have information like the property value increase on August 15th. So if we looked at like the week before the board meeting, and in some districts, they do it the night of a board meeting. So like the board meeting would be still stay when it is, and like this would happen at like 5 o'clock or 5:30, and then board members just have to come once. I mean, that's another idea. You do it at the night of the board meeting. So that could be done too. But the bottom line is we're just asking to put this on your radar. That we believe we're to the point where we need to move this forward probably 3 to 4 weeks than we're currently posting it.
Any discussion on that?
No.
Okay, the next agenda item, this is just to get your feedback on it. So Rick Braun prepared both of the attachments that are in here, not asking for like action or anything on them at this time. But Rick was starting to believe that our fees in the PAC were lower compared to some of the peer districts that he was working with and what he was seeing when folks would reserve PACs in Middleton and other districts. So on his own, he decided to prepare this research chart between us and other districts. as well as come up with a different version of a fee schedule. So he met with me maybe a month ago and just gave them to me and said, I'd like at some point that the board consider this because he feels like we're a little bit out of alignment. Really, the question for the committee is, do you want to just table this until May when we normally look at fee increases? Or would you want to look at a January 1st type thing or something else? We're really open to feedback on it, but I just wanted to kind of put this on your radar that is a little bit out there from when we normally do it, but Rick's, well, you can see from the data, his research shows that, you know, some type of adjustments would make sense for renting the B and C.
Any comments or? Any comments?
Would there be any reason to wait till May? And why not act sooner?
I think that January is a natural time for most people. Don't think about the school year as a fiscal year. They think about their fiscal year starting in January.
So the motion, move forward.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay.
Okay. And
Any other
then
discussion?
just one other quick item, this committee had heard from our natural gas rep a few months ago on really the concept of what some schools do, which is they lock in a percentage of their natural gas purchases for the winter. Ally and I have continued to just monitor what's going on in the natural gas market. Rates are significantly lower than what we paid last winter. When you look at any data on the topic of natural gas, you see that the storage is quite high. Basically, the natural economic reaction to very high rates last year was to increase supply. And so now the supply has been increased and the prices come down. So the bottom line is Ally and I are suggesting that we continue market-based this winter, take advantage of the significantly lower prices that are on the market right now, and not really look to implement any strategies for locking in rates because we feel very good about what the data is showing us as far as natural gas and our costs related to this winter.
Steve, when you're talking to your natural gas supplier, is there any indicator that we should be looking at to make that decision whether we lock it in or not? You know, is it production? You know, what are those indicators that we should be reviewing?
Sure. Yeah, the most common one that they refer to is storage. How much gas has been stored up to be distributed in the winter. And when storage levels are low, but rates are low, any mild change in the weather could cause rates to go significantly higher because there's very little inventory. But the inventory is high right now because production was, so that's the one factor they tell us to keep our eye on.
Is there an indicator which dictates when storage is high or low? You know, that's one step before that, so that we could potentially make that decision.
We will check into that, and we can definitely get you further information on it, and we'll bring this back to the next meeting to see if there's any other indicators. The good news is we're in a much better spot with this topic than we were a year ago. But yes, we'll keep exploring it.
Excellent. Any other information with it cost?
I'll check with work and see what indexes we're using to
sure.
do that.
Perfect.
Yeah. We hedged out.
Oh, okay.
We're assuming public.
We can,
entities can hedge.
yeah, but
Okay.
we haven't in the past, so,
Okay.
yeah. Any information you have from folks who do this at your place would be great.
We use a lot of energy.
That's all.
Needs motion to adjourn.
Move.
Second.
All in favor?
All right.
Aye.
And thanks for coming in today. Appreciate that. We love these efficient 1 hour meetings.